Greetings, everyone. Welcome to our exclusive Global Leading Voices webinar campaign. We are delighted to have you join us here today. Please be informed that if you have any questions during the presentation, you may type them into the question box in your control panel. The presenter will answer your questions at the end of the presentation accordingly. Now, without further ado, we will turn the time over to our
Hi everybody, welcome to this month's PCB webinar. This time it's DORA, ISO IEC 27005 and the rise of AI, securing the future of cybersecurity. I'm Martin Tully, and with me as well, virtually with me anyway, is Geoffrey. Geoffrey, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Geoffrey Taylor here. I'm the Director of Cybersecurity over at Trifork Cyber Protection. I have about 20 odd years of experience in the field. Started off in operations and then moved to GRC, and CISM and CRISC certified, ISO 27001 lead implementer and auditor, and a PECB certified trainer. And governance, risk, and compliance is a very big area of mine, and looking forward to being a panelist today.
Yeah, thanks, Geoffrey. And for myself, as I said, Martin Tully. I've got experience at 2 of the big 4 professional services organisations, degree out of Royal Holloway, and I think approximately 20 years experience now in information security, cyber risk, and more latterly as a senior consultant at CRMG. It's my first webinar that I've presented with PECB, so very much looking forward to it. Very much thankful for the opportunity from PECB, as I know Geoffrey is as well. And thank you very much for everybody that's attended our session today. Just going back to what we're covering off today in the session is to go through DORA, ISO, IEC 27005 and AI, but it's with the lens, if you like, of trying to understand where there's some differences across these 3 elements, and where they do sort of overlap and come together, which in sort of the opening few slides we've got together is firstly with DORA and incident management, and then with DORA and how 27005 can be used to assess information risk, and then taking a side step, if you like, into the world of AI, and particularly then it's focused on how through the use of DORA, 27005 and AI, the threats from third parties can be better managed. So from the outset, we know that there's quite a vast range of different experience that people have when they attend these PECB webinars. So there's a little bit of a kind of an educative point of view that we'll be covering, and also then it moves into much more the sort of practical field about how you can use these 3 distinct elements of DORA, 27005 and AI to improve your risk assessment approaches, incident management, making better use of DORA when it does come into force within the EU, and just taking a look about how AI threats and controls can be used to support the cyber risk analyst, the information security officer, whenever you're involved in applying DORA, 27005 and AI together. So we'll make a start on DORA. Going back to basics, if you like, DORA stands for the Digital Operational Resilience Act, and is currently in draft format since January 2023. So not very long ago. There's various documents that have been released that make up the DORA Act, if you like. There's going through public consultation, and the aim is then for it to become into force, into EU legislation on the 17th of January 2025. So you can see there's a 2-year process now of making sure that whatever legislation, regulation that forms part of DORA is reviewed, is commented on, and then at the end of that 2-year process, then when it does come into force, that everybody has been consulted on the Act itself, and it kind of becomes into force within the EU. So just a couple of major points really to talk about from DORA specifically, and what it is and what it's about to cover. It's very much focused on the financial institutions across the EU, And what it means by financial institutions or entities, in this case, the third bullet point, is quite broad in number. So you might sort of automatically think about large investment banks or the high street banks, but it also covers insurance organisations and organisations that are involved with financial transactions. So those kinds of organisations would be, from very large organisations that would I'd say maybe quite easily be able to accommodate a new piece of legislation or regulation, but it also covers maybe the small to medium sized organisations that are operating within the EU that needs to have DORA emphasis applied to their organisation. And the last thing to sort of mention from this first slide, it's likely to cover 5 key chapters that I'll come on to in a second. And the other key emphasis then is firstly on ICT and ICT third-party service providers to those financial institutions, which for me is probably one of the more significant piece of legislation or regulation that is not primarily, but has a focus on third-party risk management, the oversight of third parties, and making sure that you as an organisation are onboarding third parties in the right way, and you're gaining some assurance from the third party that they're doing things related to cybersecurity in the right and proper way. So it's very much focused on the EU financial institutions that operate within the EU, and ICT third-party service providers would be the key aspects, I would say, of this piece of legislation coming through. Just delving into a little bit more detail then of the 5 key chapters within DORA. First of all, looking at the risk framework elements, and this is where you can start to sort of build up a picture between DORA and 27005 when we come onto that section, about maintaining an accurate, repeatable approach for your risk framework from an ICT perspective, using various tools and systems, but in a continuous basis is probably the key part that I'd highlight there. Repeatable, making sure that risks are assessed consistently within the organisation and across then your third parties. Secondly, incident management, Geoffrey will come on to in a few minutes' time, particularly sort of focused on making sure that they are monitored, and the key part there is that competent authorities are notified within an acceptable period of time. Digital operational resilience testing, making sure that really any weaknesses, deficiencies and gaps there are identified to make sure that all elements of your risk management of operational resilience is focused on, to make sure that things operationally can continue or get back up to speed very quickly in terms of the focus on resilience from this particular framework. Moving to third parties, we mentioned in the last slide, and there's a little section towards the end of this presentation on the third party aspects, and then moving to the oversight framework. There is really sort of focus on making sure that there's kind of continued assurance, I'd say, of ICT third party organisations that are linked to financial institutions. So that's just an introduction there to what the key elements of DORA is, and the 5 main chapters that are likely to be released as part of this particular framework. Okay, Geoffrey, over to you.
Thank you. When we're looking at DORA, Article 17 is a very important part of it. It talks about the incident management, or addresses the incident management process to detect, manage, and notify about ICT-related incidents. Here, one of the things that we should all be concerned about when it comes to DORA is your incident management process, making sure that it is fit for purpose and that it is reviewed on a regular basis. The best practice would state that you would review a process every year at minimum, or if there's a significant change. In this case, we're talking about DORA. DORA obviously is a significant change, and you should determine if your incident management process is still fit for purpose. So we would recommend you review it from top to bottom and make sure that you have the proper resourcing in place. There's mention in DORA about ensuring that organizations have a appropriate size organization depending on their size and complexity. And this is something that you should take into account when you're planning for DORA. In fact, DORA specifically says, as you can see at the bottom, at least major ICT related incidents are reported to relevant senior management. And that's very, very important. it's very difficult for you to have, if there are some outcomes from your incident management process, particularly around lessons learned, root cause analysis, which DORA is very focused on. It's important that senior management is notified and involved so they can plan for how to address them. There are requirements for you to communicate to your customers under certain circumstances within DORA, and it's important to keep that in mind. And if you need to have additional activities as an outcome of your incident management process, the best people to bring that attention to is, of course, senior management. You can go to the next slide, Martin. Thank you. So first, I have to apologize for the quality of the slide, but this is taken directly from the Joint Committee of the European, basically the EBA, ESOPA, and the third one I can't remember off the top of my head, but it's basically how you classify a major incident. So if it's a critical service, essentially it's a major incident. And from there you have some other, when it's not a major incident, there's a decision tree. And the decision tree here basically indicates that if you have more than one of these categories, you must declare it as a major incident. We can move on to the next slide. Here's the recommendations. These are not enforced yet, as Martin mentioned before. 2025 is the drop dead date. Your initial notification, 4 hours, and not later than 24 hours. There's a little bit of leeway there, acknowledging that organizations may not be able to inform in the 4-hour period. Your intermediate report, 72 hours, and that is essentially to determine if there's a change in the status of the incident or there's new information. For instance, you may have a situation where you report the incident and you think that the significance of the incident is one level and new information leads you to conclude that the significance is either much higher or much lower. And then your final report within 1 month. And there are exceptions for that, but if you cannot do it within 1 month, then you have to basically notify the competent authority, and you have to inform them as to why you cannot issue your final report within 1 month. We move on to the next slide. And you're probably wondering, as we discussed before, about ISO 27005. And Martin will talk a bit about that, and then I'll come back and support him on ISO 27005.
Yeah, thanks, Geoffrey. So far we've given you an introduction, if you like, about DORA, some of the key aspects of DORA so far, the chapters that we've mentioned earlier on, and Geoffrey very kindly then covering the very important incident management or reporting aspects now within DORA. So, and there's various links that we'll be able to provide anybody if there's anything after this session about DORA and any sort of expectations that an organisation you might be working with, particularly as DORA will be released in January 2025, that you need to be prepared for now for that particular legislation. But as Geoffrey rightly says, where 27005 comes into play then as part of this presentation that we put together today for you is very much on the risk framework elements of DORA. I guess quite a lot of you on the webinar today will be quite familiar with 27005 as the international standard linked to 27001 and the 27000 series itself, if you like, as the appropriate way, if you like, of assessing risk as part of a consistent framework that organisations might need to put in place for risk assessments. And I guess the key elements of 27005 is that it comes at the area of information or cyber risk very much quite flexibly. So there's on the right hand side you can see the model there about how 27005 covers the identifying risk, analysing and evaluating risk. How you actually do that in practice might differ from organisation to organisation. There might be, I don't know, quite a high-level view of risk within one organisation that fits in this model of identifying risk to the organisation, analysing risk and evaluating risk, or you might be quite detailed and go to the kind of the bottom-up angle of information risk analysis and management to identify very technical risks, and that's also part of this particular framework that you see in front of you. What I also say about 27005, And most risk assessment frameworks that you might be familiar with is generally they do include sort of key elements of understanding the business impact, understanding the threats to the organization or the asset or the system that you're risk assessing, and then identifying ways of treating risk here as part of 27005 and what kinds of controls you need to put in place, how else you might be able to mitigate risk in terms of risk treatment or risk avoidance, bringing in elements of kind of risk insurance over the last few years. So it's very much a framework that fits most, if not all, risk assessment frameworks that you might come across in your organization or as part of your studies into cyber risk. So back over to Geoffrey with further implementations, how it can be used to help or support DORA.
Thank you. Using ISO 27005, especially if you already have an integrated management, information security management system based on ISO 27001, or you want to align with the ISO 27005 is a key part of our own support for our clients. You have the groundwork has already been done for you in terms of risk management from an information security perspective. You have the examples of consequence scales, likelihood scales, primary supporting assets, methods of attack, threats and vulnerabilities, methods to assess vulnerabilities. And if you're in an organization that is in scope for DORA, you can use this to do threat modeling. So if you have your infrastructure, no matter where it is, you could divide it into zones, and you can not only risk assess from the perspective of individual assets and critical services, you can also do it from a holistic view. You can get and we've done this ourselves, is we've gotten together the subject matter experts in a room, because when people look at them in isolation, certain risks are very evident, but we can look at the entire threat landscape for a solution and its whole ecosystem and determine where the risks are to the solution holistically. And this will not only help you in terms of your risk assessments on a regular basis, it will also help you determine if you need to modify a current risk assessment or reassess due to new threats or to new information. And it can also help you in communicating with management why certain risks are very important for them and help you with your risk reporting. So I would strongly suggest you use it because it can help you in all situations.
Thanks very much, Geoffrey. And I'd also maybe add here as well. I mean, when you are looking at, first of all, looking at something like a piece of legislation or regulation like DORA, you might come at maybe complying with DORA or putting in place the requirements of DORA in terms of a better information risk assessment approach. Maybe from a compliance point of view, you might be looking at sort of the controls or interpreting a piece of legislation into a set of controls and then carrying out or implementing those across an organization's IT systems and applications. What this moves you into sort of starts of thinking is from a 27005 is then looking at DORA through a risk lens, if you like, and not just trying to meet compliance with the legislation and regulation. What 27005 allows you to do, and most other information risk assessment frameworks, is to come at a piece of legislation or regulation like this from a risk view, and that means then identifying some of the threats to the system or application or organization, and then selecting the parts of something like a DORA or a set of controls that's based on legislation to help manage or mitigate those threats that you actually see in the environment that you're working within. So it's it's coming at it from definitely from a risk lens to meet the requirements in something like DORA, and not just a fully compliance-led activity. Geoffrey, I'd say, would you have anything to add, or you agree with that kind of viewpoint?
Just very quickly, just to add, when we later talk about third-party risk management, ISO 27005 can also be used for that, to help you determine what the threats and vulnerabilities and risks are for your third parties or fourth parties or fifth parties. In this case, before, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, it was appropriate for you to go one level. And now most organizations recognize recognize that supply chain is where they have some vulnerabilities, for lack of a better term. And in DORA, they certainly expect you to identify those vulnerabilities and to assess them and to determine what your suppliers may need to do or the risk your suppliers may bring to you. No one in today's world is doing everything themselves. And so everyone has a third party, and it's a matter of how you manage your third party and how they manage their third parties so you can lower your risks, or you can decide in maybe some unfortunate circumstances to no longer do business with that particular third party because the risk is just too high.
Yeah, that's excellent, Geoffrey, and I think that could be a key takeaway, hopefully so far for everybody on the call. Understanding particularly 27005 and yeah, not just its involvement with DORA, but also the third party aspects that we've mentioned, and yeah, we'll mention again the importance of those from this particular piece of legislation. So just another key checkpoint really in terms of the things that we've covered so far is we've covered DORA kind of separately, and then the use of 27005 in terms of identifying risk, analysing risk, evaluating risk, but also then the input of 27005 into the third party assessment and oversight perspective. And then we move on to the third element of today's presentation, which is very much excuse me, focused on artificial intelligence. And I think we could have had probably a whole day workshop on this particular topic itself. But we're looking at AI today, again, in relation really with DORA and 27005, but kicking off here with a few of the basics that we've been trawling through our research that we thought would be quite interesting to share with you today. And the first of those is this slide here. The source here is CyberArk. Just talking about really some of the cybersecurity predictions from focus on this year, next year, and 2026. And probably just going through each of these three kind of predictive years in isolation. What's kind of struck me from looking at this year, for example, on 2024, is looking at the percentages here linked to session hijacking, organizations experiencing data breaches, and looking at consolidating their technical aspects or approaches. What I thought was quite key out of 2024 is there's no mention so far of anything AI specific until you get to 2025 and 2026. So there's still the sense with AI, it's been around, I was talking to a colleague of mine since at least 1980, going back that time, maybe called different terminology, but it's nothing brand new, and that kind of feeds into the percentages here. We're looking at 2024. Some of the threats here will be no new threats, if you like, for an organization. So looking at AI specifically from a risk assessment framework, or getting systems or applications ready for predicting the future in terms of some of these AI threats, it's very much focused on the kinds of threats that will be expedited. There'll be much more accuracy in terms of some of the threats that we've seen through AI, much more sophisticated types of attacks in terms of voice recognition and that sort of thing. So it's likely to be threats that we have seen, but at much more of a larger scale, if you like, from an AI management perspective.
Correct, and just to add real quick, Martin, it's not only the size and complexity, it's the speed at which attacks will take place with AI. And that is going to be a significant concern for organizations around the world.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's a good point, Geoffrey. And then as you're going through 2025 and 2026 there, you can see there's likely to be much more of a focus on as it says there, AI-driven security mechanisms. Lots of CISOs will be looking towards transparent, rapid disclosure practices. So there's a gearing up here of focus on AI to better manage your security mechanisms, and then that results then in 2026 about possibly having people focused on managing the threat of AI specifically, so having a chief AI security officer there for some organizations, and having further regulation, like we'll come on to in a minute or so about the EU AI regulation, much more focused on AI itself. Excuse me, just take a drink of water. This is an interesting slide to put up as well, and this is feeding into the kinds of things we're talking about from AI-specific threats. If you look at some of the headlines here, I've mentioned sort of AI voice cloning, deep fake videos, overloading machine learning models. We have seen examples of these. They seem to be quite prevalent on the internet at the moment about manipulation of videos and voice, and you can sort of see how that might be able to manipulate itself into an organisation in terms of much more sophisticated types of impersonation attacks. And phishing and the like of that, but also then from a technical perspective about then things like brute force attacks and things that require lots of manipulation of data, for example, are going to be much more speedily applied. The size of these kinds of threats that will be coming through from an AI perspective, we're much more targeted, and the likelihood is that these threats will be or can produce much more impact to the organization itself.
Yeah, just a quick note on the AI voice cloning and deepfake videos. Just today in Denmark, the prime minister was impersonated, and someone released a TikTok video where she seemed to be insulting Taiwan, and she had to release a statement saying that it really wasn't her, and that people should be careful about disinformation. So it can happen to anybody. I know it's happened to the President of the United States, my home country, and there's even been, I don't know if there's anyone on the webinar who are Swifties, but I've heard there's been some deep fake videos about Taylor Swift. So, and the speed and complexity will only increase. And for those of you who know about AI created photos and images, it's already very, very difficult to tell, next to impossible sometimes, to tell the difference between a real person and an AI created image.
Yeah, and you can see, I mean, some of the examples there, they're good examples on the sort of presidential impersonations and celebrity figures, which do get out there in the public domain, much more quicker than some of the maybe sort of the things that might be going under the radar from a cyber risk perspective. But you can see the direction of travel of where this is likely to go from a threat perspective. A little bit later on, we're talking about maybe turning it upside down and looking at how we can use AI much more effectively from a controls perspective, particularly in relation to what we're talking about today for risk assessments and third-party assurance as well. And one of those, from a legislative point of view, we've already covered DORA from a legislation or regulation point of view, and there's also in effect at the moment from April 2021. I know there's various iterations that have gone through over the last few years on developing an EU AI Act, and so this is what this is, as it says there, the first instance really of a regulation focused on managing AI much more within the public domain. Covers three things that I've highlighted here on this particular side. Is unacceptable risk, so AI systems considered to be threats to people and be banned. So very much focused on the cognitive behavioural manipulation side, that some of those that mentioned by Geoffrey just a second ago. Then high risk AI systems negatively affecting safety or fundamental rights. So you can see the difference there between what might be an unacceptable risk and a high risk that might be very much targeted on, possibly the availability of some systems or key critical national infrastructure systems that might be out there from an organisational or a national point of view. And then we come on to the things that I guess we're all making use of AI at the moment, things like ChatGPT, transparency requirements. So not classified as a high risk, but the key things here about making sure that the transparency requirements of something like ChatGPT is important from an EU legislative point of view. Is the transparency requirements behind something like a ChatGPT, where it originates from, what kind of data is it using to formulate some of the outputs that you get from something like ChatGPT. So very much on the transparency side is making sure that no copyright law is being infringed, that the accuracy of data is as much as it can possibly be by using a generative AI like ChatGPT. So from a regulatory point of view for AI, and particularly from an EU perspective, there's three classifications of risk: unacceptable and high risk, and transparency requirements of something like the use of ChatGPT and generative AI. And Geoffrey, back over to you.
Yes, thank you. So at the bottom of the slide here, we have the AI principles: fairness, transparency, accountability, reliability, and safety, privacy, and security. And here we're going to discuss treating AI as just another system. And in this case, I'm referring to system, I'm referring to a management system. We have ISO IEC 42001, and this is for to have an artificial intelligence management system and to manage the risks with AI. Of course, like every other management system, it's very flexible. It's designed to meet any organization's needs and expectations and expectations of its stakeholders. Very much like ISO 27001 or ISO 22301 for business continuity. And it has the same sort of requirements, right? Management, commitment, mandate, and proper resourcing. And the best part about it is you can get certified. So independent assurance, of course, engenders trust and could give you a competitive advantage. And just as a quick side note, if you need training on 27001 or 27005, or if you need training on DORA or 42001, PCB actually has courses on all of those, just to let you guys know. We can go to the next slide, Martin. And here is to illustrate how you could use an artificial intelligence management system. I've created a fictitious financial entity to illustrate. And essentially what you have is the artificial intelligence management system, which of course should be resourced by experts in artificial intelligence. And it is, and the services, if you could, I can't see the slide right now. Yeah, thanks. So just to give you a sampling, and this is also ties into third-party management. You can have AI internally residing in a private cloud. And a private cloud is probably not provided by this fictitious financial entity that we've created. So you would also need to look at the third-party risk for the private cloud provider, the ICT risk. Then you have a data analytics service and a SaaS AI service also provided by third parties. And as you can see, it quickly gets very, very complex. And the same financial entity is using a SecOps SaaS service for anti-malware. And in DORA, you can report automatically. You can have a third party do the reporting on your behalf to the competent authorities. Now, it is clearly stated that you are still responsible. So of course you can't punt it to the other organization and say they didn't report it, so you can't find us. That's not the way it works. But in theory, since there are templates, an organization could provide a service, and you could procure that service to assist you in your reporting. Threat intelligence, anti-money laundering as a service, business intelligence as a service. So you can see that if you have both internal and external AI services being provided to you, or you're providing them to the public, to your clients, you should have an artificial intelligence management system to sort of manage all the risks around it. Not to mention, you can have the resources that are available for the AI management system. They will collaborate with those from the information security management system. And from there, you should be able to maintain your compliance with DORA.
Great stuff. Thanks for that, Geoffrey. So fictitious organization there, about how you can start to fit all these things together, if you like, from an organizational perspective. And then looking at the other side, if you like, of artificial intelligence, We covered some of the threats there that are coming through, the proliferation of those. We become much more aware of in terms of the speed and scale of typical threats, but driven by AI would mean that an organization needs to be able to also respond quite quickly when they do, see their alerts coming through of particular activity going on in the network, and they suspect it to be driven by AI and AI-specific types of threats on the systems. Turning it around a little bit in terms of what kinds of controls could an organization also put in place that might be also based on artificial intelligence as well. And we just put just a small selection here of the types of AI controls that you might be able to put in place to assess some of the controls that you need to assess as part of an AI threat. So turning around a little bit on itself, really about using maybe some AI specific controls to understand what is happening on a particular network or a system or application. So just three of those that we have identified, and there's a description there going alongside the AI control. This is part of a much longer list of AI controls that we've identified and put a description in for each one of those specific controls. So three of these: data validation and sanitization, anomaly detection systems, and incident response plan. What we're talking about here is particularly looking at these types of controls that might be specific to AI and the threats that you're seeing, but also from a third-party perspective as well. That say for instance, you've got a scenario where you as the main organisation have onboarded third parties that you're aware of them using AI as well. As part of their own framework or involvement in their cybersecurity requirements as well. They're using AI. So what you'd like to do here is to perform almost a bit of a due diligence, as it says there, of the third party's use of AI. So some of these controls is then focused on making sure that the third party and the AI that they're using goes through this kind of assurance approach. So in terms of data validation and sanitization, for example, just making sure that the information is clean, accurately labeled, free from malicious modifications. So that's really sort of focusing in on where an organization is using AI, making sure that any data validation and sanitization can be checked alongside a control like this, and it's up to the third party then to prove that data is labelled accurately and has not been subject to any malicious modifications by another fourth party, or their AI provider can't manipulate some of the data that they're sharing, for example. That also feeds into. Sorry, Geoffrey.
Yeah, if I could just interject really quickly. You can foresee a situation where a financial entity is procuring an AI service. If that AI service has the data that's manipulated, and someone files a complaint with the authorities stating that the AI prevented them from, for instance, getting a home loan. If you multiply the number of transactions a bank does, like a mortgage lender, for instance, does across an entire year, even a 0.5% is a huge number of people who are significantly impacted. And it's also important to remember that from the EU AI Act, that if you're going to use AI, in most cases, you have to do a conformity assessment. And if something changes, you need to reassess again. And we should keep that in mind when we're looking at if your third-party provider makes changes to the way they provide the service to you, you may have to reassess them. Just keep that in mind. Sorry to interrupt.
No, totally fine, Geoffrey, don't worry. And the last one there on an incident response plan is some of the terminology here that we're picking up with putting together a set of controls here for AI, or gaining assurance over a third party using AI, where, say for example, the third party suspects some data poisoning attacks, any manipulation of data. They might be using AI, for example, for their own as part of network scanning, as some of the automated process that they've got within their organization. To speed up those processes, they might be using AI. So if they suspect any anomalies or variations that might result in a particular incident that they need to respond to, that also forms part of this assurance of making sure that a third party that's linked to your organization using AI suspects an incident or has gone through an incident related to their use of AI, that there's a response there that kicks in terms of a typical incident response plan, but very much focused on maybe killing and cleaning the system that's got any sort of AI data poisoning on that system, for example. Which is quite a nice little segue in terms of the topic of today's webinar in terms of DORA 27005 and AI. When you look at controls like this from a AI perspective, Geoffrey already covered the DORA and incident response, incident management linked to then 27005, and here we have it again in an AI set of controls that it's not just a typical incident response plan that you need to have in relation to a standard or a legislation you put into place. You also require those if a third party or yourself is using AI for the speed of use or mechanisms within your organization as a viable product, if you like.
If we go back to the due diligence portion that Martin mentioned before, and my fictitious financial entity, you could conceive of a situation or a scenario where the third-party AI provider has a significant incident which impacts one of your services, and which means that you therefore have to report to the authorities. So it'd be very important for you to make sure from a contractual standpoint that you have enough lead time so you can report to the authorities, because you're still going to be on the hook for the fine.
Yeah, absolutely. Then we're coming, almost 360 degrees back to the need to notify those suitable authorities in relation to what the requirement is from DORA. So it all does knit together quite nicely, hopefully today. Just moving into the last portion of today's webinar, really is looking at, again, it's another slide about what DORA covers. 6, I guess, sort of key aspects. There's 5 different chapters that cover these to a certain degree. But 2 areas there on the oversight of critical third parties and ICD third-party risk management. As I said at the beginning, these are the 2 areas in terms of the focus or clear focus of DORA on third parties that kinds of separates it from most other legal and regulatory requirements that might be out there. Most of those, you'd imagine, from a legal perspective, would require third parties to have a certain set of controls in place. What we have noticed here with DORA is there's a clear emphasis on third parties here, making sure that you have good oversight or assurance of third parties as well as a key component of an organization's ecosystem, if you like. As Geoffrey mentioned, and one that I suspect as well, is this is likely to be off the back of some quite well-known third-party linked attacks for organizations that have been prominent in the cybersecurity world over the last few years, where a potential attacker targets the third party as a way into the main organization, almost to sort of identify the vulnerabilities in a third party rather than going to a large organization where there's likely to be very good controls in place. If they're subcontracting out to a third party, the third party itself might be the one that's the vulnerability to get to the larger organization. So we suspect this is the reason why within DORA there's a key focus on third party risk management and gaining an oversight of third parties. Then it sort of builds towards the one of the last slides for today's session, unfortunately, is sort of building up this approach to assessing third parties. And this is a typical 5-step approach, I would say, how an organisation would assess their third parties. Starting in the top left, you might have an approach to triage your critical third parties. That might include a way in which you could look at your third parties and tier them into different tiers based on the criticality of information that they use, share, store from the main organisation. So that's a way of really identifying your critical third parties in a priority order. And then the idea is to focus on, tier 1 being the most critical, looking under the hood of those third parties to understand what kinds of controls they've got in place and who's got access to data and where it's hosted. And for that, is very much a risk assessment approach for a third party. So you might be able to use 27005. You might also then include some of the AI threats that we've covered already in that particular aspect of identifying your third parties. Moving on to the steps 2 and 3, very much linked together, defining security requirements and gaining assurance from the third party that they've got those requirements in place. And that's where very much DORA comes into place. There might be a standard that you might be using that maps to DORA. You might be able to interpret the requirements in DORA very much more focused onto cybersecurity and the third party. But essentially, these are requirements you would send out to your third party as the security requirements they should have in place if they're to do business with you. And then the gaining assurance from the third parties, they respond, maybe providing some evidence, documentation, artifacts that shows that they've taken security seriously, they're aligned with DORA, and you have the opportunity to do business with them because they take it all very seriously, and you as an organisation are also meeting the requirements of DORA in terms of the oversight of the third party. There might be then, when the third party comes back, there might be some security control gaps. There might be areas of DORA that they haven't got in place, either because of the lack of resources. There might be some requirements in DORA that they just haven't got the manpower, the budget to put in place, and that's where maybe the organisation that's working with a third party might be able to utilise some AI processing to implement maybe sort of the kind of the vulnerability scanning types of approaches, anything more automated, using AI to sort of build up the security arrangements within a third party much more quickly. Those kind of things I think would be very much applied to a third party that might be at the small or medium type kind of size of organizations. There might be some elements of AI to use there for automation processes to build up their security posture. Lastly then, agreeing the third party contracts. Again, there'll be elements of making sure you've included DORA requirements in the third party contract or service level agreement with the third party, based on requirements of DORA. Also looking at the use of AI and the AI controls that we showed you on a few slides ago about incident response procedures, the sanitization of data and that sort of thing. Just making sure that the third party is taking it seriously when they're using AI for the services they're providing. So this is where, looking at the topic for today's webinar, and the clear emphasis from DORA on third party risk assessments and oversight or assurance of the third party, this is where 27005, DORA and AI can come together as part of that holistic third party assessment approach. From our perspective, anyway. We thought just to finish today's session before we go into Q&A for 10 or so minutes, some key takeaways. The PCB have said the slides will be, and the recording will be available across many platforms. So do please sort of take these away with you in terms of key suggestions or key takeaways, summary of today's webinar. If there's any further questions for either myself or Geoffrey, please do feel free to contact us either through PCB or separately via email or LinkedIn. But 5 key takeaways, just to really, if you're working especially within an organisation that needs to be prepared for DORA regulations, we would say to become prepared now. It's not really good practice to wait until January 2025 to kick in the DORA compliance project. I would say then, I'll hand over to Geoffrey for a couple of these, but assess third parties against the requirements of DORA. Clear focus now on DORA on third parties and how you can risk assess them, possibly using 27005, making use of AI, but also being aware of the kinds of threats that's posed by AI as part of this third party management framework. And the last one for me is the continuous improvement, which is a key stake in the ground, if you like, from a 27001 perspective or an ISMS. And it's really a good message to continue with, is making sure that year on year that the sophistication of AI threats, the different types of risk assessment that you might be able to put into place, and also then becoming more mature in how you achieve the requirements in DORA is all part of the continuous improvement approach that we would recommend. Geoffrey, maybe on incident management, I guess, as a takeaway.
Yeah, incident management for sure, but I was thinking of another takeaway, which is we didn't discuss too much about resilience, but the reality is that making sure that you risk manage your supply chain correctly will have a direct or indirect impact on your organization's resilience. So I want to make sure we didn't forget about that. But use 27005 to help you with threat modeling. If you want to implement zero trust, you want to look at your security architecture. If you want to look at vulnerabilities within your supply chain, it's very, very flexible, so use it to your advantage. If you are going to procure AI services, everyone's going to use AI on some level, right? It's just a matter of how deep it goes. If you're going to use AI as a key business differentiator, consider having an artificial intelligence management system, and consider the risks of using AI, both for your organization and your suppliers and for your customers. In many cases, if you have to report an incident, you must also report it to your customers. So also consider your reputational damage if something does happen. Yeah, all the best to all of you who've been here on the webinar. Thank you so much for joining us. And Martin and I have had a great time.
Thank you both, Martin and Geoffrey, for this amazing presentation and highly informative webinar. Now, there were a lot of questions that the audience has asked us, and we will not be able to take them all. Okay, let's see. The first question was, if an organization outside EU makes business with financial institutions inside the EU, is it a must for both parties to comply with DORA, or should just the financial institution within the EU comply with it?
That's an interesting question. And if you're an organization in the EU, what would probably happen is that if you're an organization outside the EU, some of those provisions would be written into your contract. That's the way I would probably think it would be handled. So you'd be a third party, and that would mean that the DORA requirements that are imposed on the financial entity would then be, some of them would then be passed on to you depending on what kind of service you're providing to that entity. And Martin, you can add, subtract, delete, or multiply.
Yeah, my usual response for this kind of question is really, and I know the presentation here, you know, DORA is is going to be an EU legislation specific to EU. The likelihood is that the requirements in something like DORA, once you get under the hood of this type of legislation regulation, yeah, there's going to be differences, I would say, subtle differences in this legislation, but they're likely to be aligned with non-EU legislation as well. In terms of the interpretation of something like DORA, interpretation of maybe the MAS in Singapore, for example, if you look under the hood, there's likely to be some similarities across those two pieces of regulation, if you like, and quite often in terms of interpreting what the requirements is in a legislation like this, you also might be using an international standard like 27001 and 2 to help you identify the compliance requirements in something like DORA. So the likelihood is the organisation outside of EU would have their own legal and regulatory requirements that won't be too dissimilar to something like DORA. There might be gaps between them in when you match them up, but the likelihood is I don't see it as being a disenabler, if that's the right word, for business operations to continue.
No, I agree. I think that in most cases, what will happen is that it's a sort of a negotiation, and there's some shades of gray, and the organization in the EU must do its due diligence, and that's a very broad term. And I think it's because, this is just my own personal opinion, due diligence means different things to different people, and we'll have to see how the legislation plays out over the next few years.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, gentlemen. Another question is, which is similar to this. Since DORA is an EU regulation, is there a similar regulation for development in the US, either in federal or state level?
Ooh, that one I have to go research. There's lots of regulations in my home country. And I know the SEC is coming out with new regulations all the time, but I can't really answer that right now. I'd have to do some research on that and get back to whoever answer that question.
Yeah, and it's the same for me. It's a really useful question, that one in particular, and both myself and Geoffrey, particularly over the course of the next year when DORA is about to be released. What does quite often happen is there's either a piece of legislation that is kicked off or sets an EU legislation in place, and also vice versa. So I would say the likelihood is that there will be, something that, maybe equivalent to DORA from the US and other parts of the world as well. But it'd be interesting over the next year, especially for myself and Geoffrey, to, maybe to connect with people on this particular webinar, as to get maybe a little bit of a group going to understand, where there are similarities across the world and the regulation. As DORA hasn't been finalised yet, so it's still going through the consultation period. So myself and Geoffrey will be very interested to understand these links to other regulations and to identify or understand where DORA will be finalised as well.
Yeah, from my perspective, as being an American, it can be a bit fragmented too. You have the SEC, you have Treasury, you have various organizations involved, and we have to see how that plays out, right? They might, it's just a guess, they might take some of the elements of DORA and just inject them into US legislation, or vice versa. And as Martin mentioned before, in the end, some of it won't be that dissimilar. The wording might be different. But again, we'd have to research that, because I can't think of anything off the top of my head. And that's probably because both of us have been very much focused on DORA.
Thank you. Another question is, does DORA affect electronic money institutions, or EMI, which make transactions on digital platforms, and are they considered as electronic banks?
That's another one I have to research because I don't want to say anything out of turn. There are 20 or 23 different financial entities that are considered. So I'll take that one back, and Martin and I will research that and get back to the person who asked that question.
Yeah, and it is another one, and it's a subtle subtle differences, particularly how financial institutions operate across jurisdictions, is, I think, one of the areas, particularly for DORA, to wrestle with, for want of a better word. It's there are, as Geoffrey rightly says, there's 20 defined financial type institutions, but where you do have payments that are going inside and outside the EU, or where they might be transactioning from and to, I think is one of the trickier issues, I think, that DORA might need to accommodate, I think.
Thank you. And one last question. Speaking of third-party risk assessment, is it always the case for vendor risk assessment where company A needs the service of company B? Can company B conduct a VRA, vendor risk assessment?
Yeah, so you might be, I mean, the questioner there, I mean, if this is the wrong answer for the questioner, please do contact us, this email or LinkedIn there, where there's a fourth party, let's say, in place. We've seen it with various engagements recently, is that you might require the third party to also do a risk assessment of their third parties because of the different services that's being provided. So yeah, it isn't uncommon for company B to do a risk assessment of company C, let's say.
Yeah, that's been my experience too. And from the perspective of looking how your supply chain can be enormous, for lack of better terms, you could conceive of a situation where, and we've seen this myself a few times, you have a supplier and that supplier has 13 suppliers. And you have another supplier that has 6. So now when it comes to risk assessing, do you want to do the 6 or do you want to do the 13? And then it's a shade of gray, right? Because it also depends on how important that supplier is to your business. So you might decide in some circumstances, well, the risk for this supplier that has 13 suppliers is going to be very difficult to manage because in the end, you're still responsible. Whereas if they're very important to the business, you might just say, well, okay, we have to dedicate more resources to it, and we have to maybe enhance our risk assessment by making sure that we assess them on a more regular basis, meaning more frequent basis. There are various approaches to it, but in the end, the supply chain is something that you have to manage, and it's just a matter of how many levels you have to go.
Thank you once again, both Geoffrey and Martin, for this highly informative webinar. Now we don't have time to address the remaining of questions. There were a lot of them, but we will make sure to post them online in the upcoming days and weeks. So check out our social media. And also please be informed that this session is recorded and will be posted on our website and YouTube channel along with the slides of the presentation. Thanks you all. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, everybody.